So thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Charlie Kuchenbrod, and my contact information is up on the screen. This program is an evolution of a workshop I have offered for several years called Seeds Need Good Soil. This alludes to the parable of the sower, which goes something like this. A sower was sowing some seeds. Some fell on the path where they were eaten by the birds. Other seeds fell among the rocks where they germinated but could not put down roots and then withered. Other seeds fell among the thorns and grew, but were choked by the weeds and did not bear fruit. And then some of the seeds landed on good soil where they yielded 30-fold, 60-fold, and 100-fold. Listen if you have ears. How is the kingdom of God like this? And then Jesus went on further to explain that the parable of seeds meant that the seeds stood for the word. And sometimes the word falls in a place where it is not heard. Other places it's heard where people hear the message and they take it to their hearts, but not fully. And when the going gets tough, they drift away. And other people hear the word and take it into their hearts, but they're seduced by worldly things and choked by that, so they do not bear fruit. And the last people represent the good soil, and they take the message to the heart, and the word grows and is multiplied 30-fold, 64, or 100-fold. So this is a really good parable for a stewardship sermon, and I'm suggesting that stewardship programs are like seeds as well, and that we need to think about preparing the soil so that they yield 30-fold to 100-fold. So these webinars are not how-to sessions. There are lots of sources for programs and program ideas, and we will steer you towards resources. We will focus on preparing the soil. This program is called The More Excellent Way, which is an allusion to Paul, 1 Corinthians, I think. And I want to suggest that the more excellent way is to align ourselves with the way of Jesus. Pardon me, I'm trying to figure out, there we go, how to make the screen work. Tonight, we begin with episode 1 of a 4-part series. Each episode will begin with a presentation and will be followed by responses from my 3 colleagues, Lee Gagan, Fundraising and Development Specialist, Mary Nelson, Regional Minister for the South Central Connecticut region, and David Cleaver Bartholomew, Transitional Associate Conference Minister for Stewardship and Financial Development. A recording of this session, as well as the slides and additional materials, will be posted on our website. You will see down at the bottom of your screen that there's a Q&A feature. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Before asking a question, look to see if there's a similar question, because you can give it the thumbs up or upvote it, and the question that people are most interested in getting answered will float to the top of the list, and that will help you and help us. I'm going to start with the big picture. Everything else is details. One of the Southern New England Conference's 4 core values is our understanding that the local church exists to make disciples of Jesus. If we are successful at making disciples, we will have abundant resources because disciples are generous with their time, talent, and treasure. Generosity is a faith practice, and like all faith practices, it is both rooted in faith and strengthens our faith. Other faith practices include worship, prayer, studying scripture, extending hospitality, forgiveness, and serving others in God's name. A discipleship approach to stewardship is built on the truth that you can give without having faith, but you can't have faith without giving. Some people resist this truth, and we will talk about cultural influences later in this series. In most churches, people are not lining up to serve on the stewardship committee. How many of you have said something like, I will do anything, just don't ask me to serve on the stewardship committee? In part, I think this is because the charge of the Stewardship Committee is frequently misunderstood. It is not the job of the Stewardship Committee to get people to give more money, or remind them of their obligation as members, or to get people to cover their fair share of expense, or to balance the budget. It is the job of the Stewardship Committee to help people make faithful choices about what they do with their money and other resources. It is about accompanying people on a faith journey and about becoming disciples together. Stewardship is often part of the financial structure of a church, but it is more aligned with faith formation. Stewardship is not the role of the trustees, it is the role of the deacons, to put it in the framework used by many churches. When you think about stewardship as getting people to give more money, you're adopting a transactional approach to giving. You are going to, quote, be realistic, quote, and accept the world as it is, working with existing individual beliefs, behavior, and congregational culture. When you think about stewardship as a faithful choice, you open the door to transformation. This is not accepting the world as it is, but having faith that God is at work in the world and that discipleship is transformational. Just as the Stewardship Committee needs to reframe their work, many clergy would benefit by seeing fundraising as ministry. It is an opportunity to help people grow in faith by discovering what is sacred in their lives, by helping people discover their true calling, and by helping people make faithful choices. I observe that many pastors avoid the topic of money and wealth, either by choice or because they are discouraged from doing so. What stewardship approach do you think this reflects? So here's the big picture. I've put the best stuff right at the beginning. Faith and money do not exist in separate realms, even if that is normative in our culture. The stewardship challenge is to help people understand money in the context of faith. Now we're going to get to some details. Jesus talked about money all the time. This might surprise some people because we have selective hearing. Jesus talked more about money than any other single topic, unless you want to group everything in the realm of heaven category. People have studied this and counted up his words, and roughly half of the parables are related to stewardship. If you want to adopt a transformational approach to stewardship, you're going to have to talk about money as often as Jesus did, even if some people then say that all we ever talk about is money. I think the best single book for stewardship folks to read is The Spirituality of Fundraising by Henry Nouwen. When I do workshops in person, I bring copies of this book to sell. Among the book's virtues is that it is very short. Henry identifies why Jesus talked so much about money. It's about our deep human need for security and where we can find real security. Spoiler alert. Money and wealth offer only the illusion of security. Real security is found in God, in relationships, and in creating and living in a compassionate, just, and peaceful world. The allusion to a divided heart is scriptural. Matthew 6:24, as styled by Eugene Peterson. You can't worship two gods at once. Loving one God, you'll end up hating the other. Adoration of one feeds contempt for the other. You can't worship God and money both. One of the reasons I love Nouwen's book is that it is so encouraging. When we frame fundraising faithfully, it gives us the opportunity to proclaim that we believe what we believe in such a way that we offer other people an opportunity to participate with us in our vision and mission. Nouwen also invites us to be cheerleaders in the best sense. We have a vision that is amazing and exciting. We are inviting you to invest yourself through the resources God has given you, your energy, your prayers, and your money in this work to which God has called us. Finally, Nouwen just nails the shift from transactional to transformational when he says fundraising is always a call to conversion. I'm going to talk more about this conversion in a moment. The conversion from it is all about me to it is all about us. I am not afraid to ask people to be generous supporters of the church, so long as the church is being true to God's calling. If your church is not being true to God's calling, you can run a fabulous stewardship program and it will not succeed. The problem in that case is not the stewardship work, it is that the church needs to better align itself with God's calling. We will talk more about moving from maintenance to mission in our next webinar. Take a moment to read this quote. There is some tough love here if you read it backwards. If you do have a problem asking someone for a large sum of money to support your church, is it because you have not prayerfully committed to placing your whole trust in God and become clear that you are concerned only for the kingdom? Or is it because that you have not learned to love the rich for who they are rather than for what they have? Or is it because you do not believe that you have something of great value to give them? Which one of these might you need to work on so that you will also have no problem asking for a large sum of money? Just read this while I have a sip of water. The blurb for these webinars said that the principles underlying effective stewardship approaches were well understood, but not always well known. I'm going to quickly go through some evidence. This is another excellent book. Very little of what I'm sharing with you is original thinking. It's not original to Bill Enright either, but he expresses things very well. The same themes of ministry and discipleship keep coming up. I'm going to go quickly through 3 quotes. Focus on the bold. Please download the slide deck and read them carefully. I keep them in my presentation because different people at different times have told me that they found significant meaning or something really clicked for them with one of these quotes. Giving is the path to connection and realizing our potential as magnificent creations of the divine. Giving, when rooted in gratitude, is joyful. Discipleship is joyful. It's about living fully and having a full and meaningful life. At this point, I usually offer some testimony about how my wife and I decided to become tithers and how this decision has changed me. In order to save time and in order to make this easy to access if it will help you in your settings, I've recorded some short testimonies, why we tithe, how tithing has changed me, and what I have earned or not. And they will be posted on the website with the materials from this workshop. I hope that we will be able to build a collection of resources like this, and I invite you to make contributions. Short version. My wife and I have given away more than 10% of our gross for 30 years, and we are certain that we are the better for it. Whatever I have earned is small in comparison to the unearned privileges I have benefited from and the blessings I have received. The only response can be gratitude and generosity. Now, I am aware that we are privileged people. So that is part of why I feel so blessed. But I know that the choice to give for many people is sacrificial, and that we don't measure generosity in terms of absolute amounts. Each person will find their own balance as they go forward. I want to return to the themes of conversion and transformation. I'm going to share 2 paradigms about wealth and generosity and argue that one paradigm is deeply rooted in our culture and the other is deeply rooted in our faith. These paradigms really describe the endpoints of a spectrum. Many people are in the middle somewhere and many bounce around in the spectrum. Disciples are intentional about moving in one direction. So one paradigm is called mine, mine, mine. You may remember the seagulls from Finding Nemo. And the other paradigm is called How Blessed Am I? In the mind, mind, mind paradigm, I believe that whatever I have, I earned it and I deserve it. And because I earned it and I deserve it, I'm entitled to decide how to use it for my own benefit. And if I choose to give some away, I am diminished. I'll have less. And because I'm concerned with keeping what I deserve and earned, I have anxiety about not having enough, particularly in comparison to others. In the how blessed am I paradigm, what I have is a blessing and I receive it as a trustee. God yearns for what is best for me and also for others. So I can't use my resources only for myself if I'm seeking to be faithful to what God calls us to be. And in giving, I am creating a better world. I am enhanced. I'm willing to live in the realm of sufficiency as opposed to the realm of acquisitiveness. So you can see how this goes. I can provide some other comparisons or contrasts. How much should I give away compared to how much should I keep? What will I get in return compared to what will the impact be? What don't I have? What do I have? And finally, what do I wish I had compared to what can I do with what I have? I want to emphasize that we live in a culture of mass consumerism that promotes the mind, mind, mind paradigm and the idea that life is about consumption and that this will lead to the good life. If we are about making disciples, we have to confront this honestly. Consumption can lead to happiness in small doses, but as a way of life, it will not lead to a meaningful life. It does not lead to a more compassionate, just, and peaceful world, and it is not pleasing to God. Here is a practical exercise. You all remember what WWJD stands for, right? What would Jesus drive? Before proceeding with this illustration, I want to start by saying it's a bad illustration because any review of scripture would lead us to the conclusion that Jesus wouldn't drive, he would take the bus. Now, if you own a car or cars, which end of the spectrum are you closer to when you make purchasing decisions? Are you thinking about rewarding yourself, or are you thinking about sufficiency? Are you thinking about functionality, or are you thinking about status? I suspect that the parking lot at my church is a lot like the parking lot at many churches. There's a mix of different kinds of cars. Car purchasing is just one of the consumption choices we make. I'm not here to castigate people who have purchased upscale cars. My wife drives an Audi. I want to illustrate that we are really living in this spectrum and that we make choices every day that determine where we are in this spectrum. I also want to illustrate that we live in a mind, mind, mind culture, and the challenge for churches, this is a challenge for churches seeking to make disciples. 1 hour a week in worship is not going to offset the other 6 days and 23 hours when people are living in the culture. Now, I realize this example pertains mostly to privileged people that have some discretionary income and choices that they make about things like buying cars. Income inequality is real, and the reality is that some people are in a much tougher place economically, especially in the current day with the pandemic. So I do not want to suggest that everybody has the same degree of flexibility. However, everybody can make a choice to be generous. We know from United Way campaigns where they do contributions as payroll deductions, so we can compare the gift to the size of the compensation, that percentages are highest at the very highest and the very lowest end of the spectrum. So people will give sacrificially, perhaps because they understand how important the giving is. And we want to provide everybody with the opportunity for support. But we also need to realize that if we're looking to provide money for our mission and ministry, there's more money available from people with discretionary income who have these kinds of choices. So this is the kind of conversation we need to engage them in. Now, it turns out that living generously is good for you. Academics have studied generosity, and people who give generously are better off. They are happier, physically healthier. They show more interest in personal growth. They are mentally healthier, and they have a greater sense of purpose in life. So, and other research shows that it is not these things that lead to generosity. It's not if you're happy, healthy, and all these things, you'll be more generous. It is, if you are generous, you will be more of these things. So tell me, why is it that we often approach people like we are asking them to do something bad for themselves when they ask for a gift? We shouldn't be surprised. It turns out that Paul was not writing metaphorically. You will be enriched in every way for your great generosity. I hope that these sessions will encourage conversations in your congregation, and here are some for you to think about. Why do we hesitate to ask people to be generous supporters of the mission and ministry of our congregation? Do we want to get over this? How can we get to a more faithful place regarding generosity and stewardship? And I'm sure that you've thought of other questions as we've gone through this. So now we're going to hear from our responders. And then we're going to move to questions and answers. And after questions and answers, we'll wrap up by sharing some resources and suggesting some next steps. So let me call on my colleague, Lee Gagan.
Thanks, Charlie. It's funny you mentioned Spirituality of Fundraising. That was actually the first book gifted to me when I started my position. And I was told it wasn't given to me just because it was short, but I agree with you, it's excellent. And we both share an appreciation for Nouwen's invitation to be a cheerleader. By that, I mean open communication, and specifically communication about money. If I can share two messages today, that would be that transparency is key. And the second one, make talking about money the norm. So my first point, what do I mean when I say transparency? Well, that is being open and honest about where the money goes. Yes, accounting information is important, but it's insufficient on its own. Rather, focus on stories of impact. So that's the difference between saying the money we raise goes for staff compensation, operating expenses, etc., and saying something along the lines of your support allows us to have a robust staff. And because we have staff, we have such and such impact on the world. So why a story rather than the numbers? Well, people don't remember the numbers or bullet points. People do respond to emotion, and feelings drive action. So your donors, the people in your congregation, they want stories. They will remember how you made them feel. A deep emotional connection is a strong motivator to not only donate, but to become a champion for your church, a loyal donor, a fundraiser, and a lifetime supporter. So I'm going to give you a few examples of what I mean by a story. So you could have behind the scenes, showcase what happens in your church during the weekdays when folks aren't there. What are the staff doing? What programs take place in the church that benefit the wider community? Tell a story of why a donor gives. That helps other donors want to give too. There's a mirroring effect that can happen. Lastly, a story of resilience. So talk about somebody recovering from hardship, or the story of your church finding success through a recent campaign. Most importantly, remember that people give because they believe in the mission and also the vision for the future. The second point I want to highlight is the importance of making talking about money the norm. As Charlie mentioned, Jesus talked about money all the time. It's a ministry, yet it doesn't really get much airtime, whether it's because we're uncomfortable talking about it or we assume folks don't want to discuss it. Talking about money isn't happening as much as it should be. And unfortunately, the importance then isn't highlighted like it is with our other ministries. So I encourage you to talk about money in positive ways rather than only when you're in an emergency situation and you need to talk about money. Make it the norm. The goal isn't to get people just to give money. The goal is to help people follow Jesus when it comes to stewardship. That includes money as well as how they use their time and their talent. Trust me when I say that you will have members of your congregation thanking you for being open about what's hard to talk about for many of us. People want to know what God thinks about a whole bunch of things, and that includes money.
Thank you, Lee. We do have a question. I do want to say that sometime, I hope tomorrow, that the slide deck will be available on our website. It will be in an Adobe PDF format, not the native PowerPoint, but you will be able to download that and share that. I want to call now, we'll get to all the questions in the Q&A session. Mary.
Thanks, Charlie. Likely, I have 2 points to make, and they really echo points that Charlie lifted up in his conversation today, but I want to make sure that we really highlight and frame these. The first is that everything that we have really belongs to God. We are caretakers of what we have been given. So what we have earned, what has been given to us, what we own. I live in a house that was built in 1837. It's not my house. I just am hanging on to it for a little while. Everything we have doesn't really belong to us. It belongs to God. And we have been given what we've been given so that we can make the world a better place, so that we can help to grow, to create the reality that is God's dream for the world, or so that we can manifest that dream into reality. So we're caretakers. We don't own what we own. We are stewards of what we own. And that's what stewardship is really all about, is the understanding that we have been given many, many gifts. And whether we earned them or not, whether we deserve them or not, is not the point. How we use them faithfully is the point. How we use our gifts in service to others, in service to the world, is the whole point of what we're doing. So that's number one, is that everything we have belongs to God, and we are mere caretakers of that. That's the root word of stewardship. We are stewards, we are caretakers, we are not owners. And the second thing that I want to lift up is that generosity is a way of being. Generosity is a stance toward the world. It's not an activity. It's not a checkbox that you check off. It's not a thing you do to be a good person. Generosity is a way of life. It's a way of being a faithful person in the world. How can I help the world become the world that God dreams? By being generous. Generosity is easier to invite in other people when you live it yourself. So I am always trying to become a more generous person. And my experience of becoming a more generous person then helps me invite other people into generosity as well. When I give to the conference, when I give to Silver Lake, when I give to my local congregation, that's meaningful for me. And I try to share that meaning with other people. Generosity is a more faithful way to live. If you are constantly worrying about where your next thing is going to come from, or how to acquire, or how to shore up your security, you are not being faithful to God. You are living in fear. But a framework of generosity a stance of generosity. Generosity as a way of being really is a freer and more faithful way to live. So I want to invite you to think about how you might become a more generous person. It's a lifelong journey. I can remember the moment that I made the decision to become more generous. And it's something I've been working on for about 20 years. And I don't expect that I will ever stop trying to become more generous.
Thank you, Mary. I want to add on to one of your points. Generosity being a lifestyle or framework. Giving away money is easy. All right. What's hard for me, at least, and I think the most generous thing I can do is approach and meet each person and give them the benefit of the doubt that their intentions are good. And that's going to be my starting point in my interaction with them. I think that's a generosity of heart or spirit. And for me, that's a lot harder than writing a check. David.
Thank you, Charlie. I love that one. Okay. All right. First off, I want to thank my wonderful 3 colleagues. It is an honor to be here and on this webinar with the 3 of you. I feel so privileged. And as the people who are viewing us will notice that we're all coming at this from slightly different perspectives, but we're all in, there's a lot of overlap with what we say. And I come at tonight's topic of faith foundations of stewardship from my training as a biblical scholar. And so I'm going to be taking that approach, and a lot of it has to overlap with what Mary was just saying about stewardship, about stewards. And I've written several blogs about that, which are posted on the conference's website, and I encourage you to go and to read those when you have some time to do it, because it will help to fill out where I come from with stewardship. But the last one that I wrote about started off with saying, at its core, stewardship is countercultural. Okay, and Charlie's slides 16 and 17 point that out when he's talking about the mind mentality. It made me think of a 2-year-old actually, versus the blessed mentality. Okay, and so stewardship really is about metanoia, a change of mind, a change of heart, and a way of looking at the world. Stewardship involves changing one's mind from seeing ourselves and our world from a human perspective to seeing ourselves and our world from a divine perspective. And that's key. Okay, and stewardship is countercultural because of that, as Charlie lined up those examples in his slides. Okay, and because it is countercultural, we do not come by it naturally, or we do not come by it easily either. Rather, it's something that has to be formed over time. We have to live into our stewardship. So again, as Charlie said, stewardship formation is part of faith formation, is part of discipleship formation. All of these come together in our overall Christian formation. It's an ongoing process as we are in the world but not of the world, and we're constantly going to be tugged back into the world. And stewardship is telling us to keep divine perspective at the forefront, not the world's perspective and God's vision for the world. Now, 3 ways in which stewardship is countercultural that I want to talk about this evening in this lifelong process. First has to do with, as Mary articulated, everything belongs to God. We can say God created the world, God is the owner of the world, and all that is in it. Psalm 24 talks about this. Leviticus talks about us being sojourners and tenants in the world. 1 Timothy chapter 6 talks about the way in which we come into the world with nothing and we leave with nothing. We do not own anything. The Bible is very clear about who the owner is, and there is never a transfer of ownership from God, from the divine, from God's holdings to ours. Instead, what we have are stewards. That's us. And stewardship is, again, a manager of another's resources. So what we are managers of God's resources in this world, including ourselves. We do not belong to ourselves, but rather we belong to God. So all that has been entrusted to us and is under our care, and all that we have that is under our control actually belongs to God, and we are to use this in a way in which God would have it being used. Okay, and with that in mind, we get in some difficulty, I think, and this is a problem. And Chuck Lane, who is the author of the next book we're going to be reading on Ask, Thank, and Tell, says this about it. We need to be careful. There it is. We need to be careful about things like the oftentimes used phrase that everything we have is a gift from God. Okay, the problem with that phrase is that when we think of giving or receiving gifts, we usually think of the transfer of ownership. When someone gives a gift, we understand that the ownership of the item that's been given has gone from the person who is giving the gift to the person who is receiving the gift. That is a completely foreign element to the Bible. With God, there never is any transfer of ownership. God is still the owner. And although it might be a bit awkward and take a lot of practice, we should be very hesitant to use or stop using the gift language in favor of other language such as trust or returning to God or giving back to God. We can say that everything that we have is a trust from God that we hold and that God has placed under our care in our management. Now, you may think that this is splitting hairs and talking a lot about it, but I think we all know the power of language and how it shapes our thinking. Just think about the debate that we have had in our churches with regard to inclusive language. Language is powerful. And as long as we use the language of ownership and of giving that implies transfer of resources, we're going to have a problem. We have to be very careful about using that language. Also, around that same thing, in Deuteronomy 8, Moses offers a warning to the Israelites as they're about to go into the promised land about thinking that all that they have is something that they earned on their own. And in Deuteronomy 8, it says, "Do not say to yourself, my power and my might, by my own hand I have gotten wealth. But remember that it is the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the power to get wealth." So it is not by ourselves that we have all of these things that have been placed under our care. Okay, so let's see. The next point that I want to raise after the fact that we are stewards of God's resources and that we are to use them in the way in which God has entrusted them to us. And that's where we get excited about asking people to fundraise or to fund the mission and use those resources to fund the mission in the world and the mission that God is calling us to do of a more just world. And in the Southern New England Conference language, that's using the language would be of spreading the love and justice of Jesus. So it's possible to get excited about people inviting them into this alternative vision and this mission that God is on through us, through the financial resources and our time and our talents to bring about that more just world, one in which more and more people experience God's love, especially through Jesus Christ. And finally, as he mentioned, as Charlie mentioned, and as the others have, that how I live with money is a faith issue. Money and faith in the Bible are inextricably linked. You cannot separate them like our culture does, and especially our church culture does. Those two are held together, and that's another way in which stewardship is countercultural to our society. And we talked about some lines of Jesus where it says you cannot serve God and money. Jesus also said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. There are a couple of other wonderful examples of how to use those resources. One I would point to is Zacchaeus, who uses his financial resources and distributes them to the poor. And also the rich man in Mark, who has a hard time giving away his possessions and goes away sad. So if we look at how to use to steward those things that are under our care, generosity is one of them, and using them to promote God's kingdom is another one. And we look at Jesus as our primary example of what it is to be a good and faithful steward. And generosity obviously is a part of it. We are created in the image of God, and God is a generous God. And therefore, we are created, it is in our DNA to be generous. Okay? And so we, as Charlie mentioned earlier, you cannot be a faithful, struggling Christian and not have a generous spirit to you. That is just part of being a Christian and being and working on your faith. A stingy Christian is an oxymoron. So
that might be a good place to stop for a moment.
Right there. Yep.
I do want to get to some questions. Peter asks about the pastor's role and should the pastor have access to individual pledge and giving information. That will be part of our second or third episode. I want to say I think primarily the pastor's role is to first keep raising questions of identity and purpose in the life of the congregation, and also to be a teacher. But it's important in congregations that there be conversations about what's the role of the pastor, what's the role of the lay people, so that you don't get confused and so that you can hold each other accountable. Should pastors have access to individual pledge and giving information? Absolutely, unequivocally, yes. One of the books we'll recommend is from Cliff Christopher. He says that pastors not knowing what people give is pastoral malpractice. You need to know who to thank. You need to know who to ask for certain roles. You need to be able to measure the effectiveness of programs. You need to figure out what pastoral needs are reflected in people giving more or more frequently giving less. He gives other reasons, and we'll give a more comprehensive answer in a future session. Wendy asks, what is your favorite scriptural text? And so mine might surprise you. Mine is, and the people grumbled. And that's from the story of Zacchaeus. And you may remember when Jesus went to dinner with Zacchaeus, the rich man, the people grumbled, but that Jesus came back with a converted heart and a lot of Zacchaeus's assets and a promise from Zacchaeus to repay all he had done wrong to. But while Jesus was doing his ministry, people grumbled. And that just reminds me that in your congregation, as you go about your ministry, as you talk about these things, some people are going to grumble. Mary Lee, David, can you quickly cite a verse? You've already cited some, David.
I would so going back to Peter's question, I just typed an answer in. But I'd say part of the pastor's role is getting people excited about being part of the mission and offering ways to support the church, not only financially, but through time and their talents and other ways to be involved.
Go ahead, Mary.
I would jump in. One of my favorite scriptures is actually Jesus teaching the words of the Lord's Prayer. Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. For me, generosity, stewardship are part of manifesting the realm of God, as I said, and being part of living out that prayer, making God's kingdom come on earth.
One that is also helpful, I think, is Deuteronomy 16:17, which talks about proportional giving. And about returning a portion to God and God's service as you have been blessed by God.
Thank you. Paul asks about equating stewardship with finances and points out that we are stewards of non-financial assets, our times, our talents, gifts of the Spirit. That's absolutely true. And I tried to capture some of that in my comments, but also I know that people shy away from talking honestly and forthrightly about money. And so I'm putting some emphasis there to hopefully encourage and empower people to go in that way, because I've seen churches where they talk about stewardship and time, talent, and treasure, and they spend more time talking about time and talent because they're reluctant to talk about the financial stuff. So I'm not meaning to make it only or exclusively about that. I want to make sure that we don't shy away from dealing with that aspect of it. Do any of the other panelists want to add to that?
I would echo what Lee said earlier, which is that we need to make talking about money normal in the church. And this is part of doing that. Very often, and Paul, I'm not saying you're doing this right now, but very often when we hear that, but what about time and talent? It's a way to try to stop us from talking about money. Obviously, this is a webinar that is about money, but very often in the church, that's brought up as kind of a red herring to direct us away from the conversation. And we need to make talking about money normal and acceptable in the church.
And with that said, I would add two other things to that holy trinity of time, talent, and treasure. Another church introduced this to me. Trees and tissue, if you want to keep the T alliteration. Trees in the sense of stewardship of the creation. It reminds us of that because we are stewards of the creation. Also tissue in the sense of human tissue. We also need to be stewards of our own health. Oftentimes that gets forgotten, that God has given us a body that we are supposed to take care of. Okay.
I thought you were going to go in a different direction with tissue, which is, you know, I donate platelets and I've donated blood and I'm an organ donor. On my license, I've checked off that box. And so, you know, that's another treasure that we have that we can share. A question about tips for talking about money when not together in person. Conversation about money can be easier in person. It is true that we need to create safe spaces to talk about money in person or online. And I think we can do that the way we frame questions, the way we give people opportunities to tell each other's stories. We like to say that we don't talk about money, but we do indirectly in a lot of ways. One safe way to get people talking about money is to do a money autobiography exercise where you give people a list of questions. And a question might be, how did your parents differ in their relationship to money, and which parent are you more like as an adult? Trust me, I've gone through this. I've done this experience. People that say that, you know, we can't talk about money here will be happy to talk about their family history and how that has formed them. And if we find kind of different ways into the conversation, we can do that. I spend a lot of time online on Zoom and other things, and I've kind of gotten used to it in a lot of ways. And so I think that you can create intimacy even online. For instance, Zoom has a feature where you can have breakout groups, where you can take a larger group and break it out into a smaller group, and you can have 3 or 4 people talking about something and then come back to a group. So I'm not 100% certain that it's easier to talk in person. And I know that some of the most difficult conversations I've ever had have been in a car because we're both looking forward and we don't have to look at each other. So you have to find what your safe space is. Church people are afraid to talk about money because they are afraid of conflict and possibly losing friends. It may be about the fragility of our relationships with the church. Please comment. That's a good question. My panelists, feel free to jump in. I think that in church, we need to create vessels of trust, and that we ought to be able to create an environment where people can disagree without threatening our relationships with each other. I know that that is difficult, but if we can't do that within a faith community, we have little hope of doing that in other places as well. So it may be about creating safe spaces. It may be about building up trust over time. It may be how we structure conversations. Panelists?
I would add, oh, go ahead, Mary.
Cliff Christopher in Not Your Parents' Offering Plate says specifically around pastors' reluctance to talk about money in church, that often he thinks that it's because pastors are afraid of rejection, that we are talking about money feels like a risk because it feels like we're trying to sell something. And then we're afraid that people are going to say, no, I'm not going to buy what you're selling. I think, Charlie, your point is really right on, that this is part of building a relationship of trust. And I'm not sure that I agree with Christopher that it's about a fear of rejection. I think it's a fear that the relationship isn't strong enough, as you said, Richard. But I think it's also a fear or a reluctance just to rock the boat. Things are easy, things are good, let's keep that. And then, a lot of people don't talk about money because they don't have any money. Or they don't talk about money because they don't want to make somebody else feel uncomfortable about their maybe theoretical lack of money. The more we talk about money, the more that discomfort goes away because we're comfortable sharing information about our financial lives and our financial backgrounds. The more we make assumptions about people without actually having the facts or having an understanding of someone's experience of money, the harder it is to talk about money. You actually strengthen your relationship when you talk about it.
So I'd like to take one more question and then conclude by sharing some resources and honor our time commitment. Charles asks about personal testimonies. I don't think you have to abandon personal testimonies. I'm not sure how you are doing worship now. My church is doing virtual worship and it's pre-recorded and then broadcast on Facebook. We have had some very powerful recorded testimonies. And in a way, they're somewhat better than in-person testimonies. Why? Because people get to record them and do it again if it didn't get right. They can keep it shorter. And you can hear and see them well, which isn't always true live. So you can still have powerful testimonies in a virtual setting. If you've got a website or a Facebook page, you can post things. And we are hoping that churches will share some testimonies, other short pieces that we can put on our website so that if you don't have something or the capability to produce one on your own, that you can borrow from somewhere. So I hope that you don't feel like you can't do testimonies because they are so critically important. We just need to do it in a new and different way. And that's part of the challenge of moving into this new era where we're never going back to the old way. All churches will need to have a digital presence in the future, even when we're able to gather together and meet on Sunday mornings. And we all await and pray for the day when we can sing and hug and enjoy each other's company and celebrate together the joys of life. So more comments are coming in and we're going to have to wrap up. Clergy need to speak about their own giving. I think so. I would endorse that and sharing that information. Let me go to wrapping up with some resources. And I need to find where my PowerPoint presentation went. I'm baffled. Okay, let me say that we have a list of resources that will be with the slide deck. It includes some websites that you can go to, the national website, our own website, steal from other denominations. We have a list of books, several of which we have featured here tonight. We have a list of websites. I very much like the Lewis Center for Church Leadership. They have a weekly email blast that goes around and it's on target much of the time. It covers more things than stewardship, but their stewardship materials are very good. The Lake Institute on Giving and Philanthropy at the Indiana University. So there are places that you can go to. And many of these organizations, you can sign up for a free newsletter like the Lewis Center, and you will get good and inspiring information. There's a tremendous amount of resources out there, which is one reason why we're focusing on preparing the soil, because you can find stewardship ideas and stewardship programs. One of the books on the list is Tony Robinson's Cultivating Generous Congregations. He has a chapter with 10 different ways to do a fall stewardship campaign. There are how-to manuals out there. So we will post the slides, look for that. We'll probably break out the resources separately from the slide deck and post that on the web so it's easy to access. I want to thank our panelists for joining us this evening. I want to thank all the people who have participated and who have shared their thoughts and asked questions. This is the first of 4 chapters, and we are looking forward to coming back on a weekly basis for several weeks and sharing additional thoughts. If you would like to get a question or a comment to me as we're preparing the next sessions, my email address was on the top slide, and it's kuchenbrood@sneucc.org, but you can't spell Kuchenbrood, but you can look it up on the slide deck. Again, any closing comments from the panelists before we say goodnight? Outstanding. Thank you all so much. Stay safe, stay well, and hopefully we'll see you at next week's episode. Have a good night.